I'm Joe Lample. When I created Growing a Greener World, I had one goal: to tell stories of everyday people, innovators, entrepreneurs, forward-thinking leaders who are all, in ways both big and small, dedicated to organic gardening and farming, lightening our footprint, conserving vital resources, protecting natural habitats, making a tangible difference for us all. They're real, they're passionate, they're all around us. They're the game changers who are literally growing a greener world and inspiring the rest of us to do the same. Growing a greener world, it's more than a movement, it's our mission. See this? It used to be this, and that, and all of that, and so much more. Compost is the natural decomposition of materials that we see and use every day. And from our backyards to our kitchens and even our offices, the raw material for making compost is all around us. And with a few simple steps, all of that becomes this sooner or later. In nature, compost happens naturally. The forest floor is really just one big thick carpet of compost. And look how well the forest thrives. No extra fertilizers, pesticides, or crazy chemicals going on there, and no involvement from us. It just takes a little longer, that's all. But when we apply a few simple steps at home, not only can we make great compost for free, but we can do it faster, without any smell or pesky critters. And when we use it in our gardens, there's nothing better. And something else about compost: it's the ultimate way to recycle. Compost is such an amazing and mysterious thing. It's hard to imagine that something so basic in looks, like all of these decomposing leaves that will become compost, can do so much to improve the health of our garden. It's like a multivitamin for our plants and soil. And yet it's such an important component of our soil that we have PhDs all over the world that do nothing but study soil science for a living so that farmers and gardeners alike can get the most out of it. Dr. Julie Grossman is one of those people. She's an assistant professor at North Carolina State University. And what else? The Department of Soil Science. The broad focus of her work is to explore the ways in which we can better manage plant-soil microbe relationships in order to enhance soil fertility, with the ultimate goal of developing sustainable food production systems. We caught up with her at Old Salem Museum and Gardens in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
So composting is really nothing more than just a managed decomposition process that's controlled by microbes, by microorganisms. And it's simple in that it happens everywhere around us all the time. If we didn't have decomposition, we would have leaves up to our eyeballs in forests because nothing would ever go away. But in composting, we're using the complexities of the soil to break down the organic material, the waste that we produce. Compost really is black gold. It has properties that can release nutrients to your garden, to your crops and your flowers over time. It also acts as sort of a glue or a magnet to hold on to nutrients when they're free in the soil, so it can hold on to nutrients that might otherwise be lost in a rain event. It also helps to improve your overall physical soil environment for roots to be able to grow and proliferate freely. It can create air spaces and hold moisture to be able to provide that moisture to crops over time. One of the hottest areas of research today is understanding the disease-fighting properties of finished compost. Compost is full of microorganisms that are helping us do what we want them to do in the garden, which in some cases is to help control diseases, parasites, and other pests that can otherwise harm our garden plants. As much as we know about the organisms that are living in our compost and what they're doing, we're really only at the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, Julie, you're the expert. And a question I think we all want to know: how does that cardboard box and that head of lettuce and that bushel of leaves become, as you said, black gold, this beautiful compost? What's the process going on to make all that happen?
Although the mechanism and the steps involved in composting are really quite simple, the activities that are going on in your bin when you're making the compost itself are actually pretty complex. In a teaspoonful of compost, you can have 1 billion bacteria and over 9 miles of what we call fungal hyphae,
Wow.
which are just long strings of fungal filaments that exist in every soil. So what's happening when we're making this compost is first the bacteria are moving in, and they're very active. They're really the prime players in the composting process. And they start to break it down, start to undergo that decomposition process, and it results in a very hot pile. Your compost pile can be up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit when you have active composting happening.
And that's why it's all heating up like that.
That's why it's heating up, because of the activities of the microorganisms. The next ones to come in following the bacteria are the fungi. And when the fungi come in, they operate a little bit cooler temperature and they start to finish off the process, followed by the earthworms. And so when you have finished compost, you'll often find worms, just like you see in your garden soil in your compost bin.
And that's why they say if you have earthworms in your soil, that's a good thing, because they have all of that bacteria and fungi that are their food source.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct.
So if compost is so good, and we know that it is, why don't we make our beds 100% compost?
You definitely don't want your beds to be 100% compost. And that's because in order for soil to function properly, it really needs mineral deposits and mineral materials such as sand and silt in order to have proper drainage. Only a small portion of any typical soil is made of organic matter, such as what you have in compost.
Well, that's fine with me because compost is precious and I never have enough of it. So it's nice to know that I don't have to make it so rich in that method. But how much do I add to make it just that right ratio?
That's a great question. In general, you want to add about 1 to 3 inches of compost to your surface soils of your already existing garden soil, and then you can mix that in. And in that way, you'll end up with the right ratio of compost to already existing soil and give you those hard, solid materials like the sands that you need to have good soil.
Good. Well, now that I've hopefully piqued your interest in starting your own compost pile, where do you put it in your yard? Well, you could put it in full sun, and the extra heat will help activate those microbes which cause the compost to break down. That's a good thing. Or you could put it in full shade, and the shade is going to help reduce the chances of your pile from drying out. And moisture is really important too for compost to happen. So the bottom line is there are pros and cons to wherever you put it. So put it where it's most convenient to you, because you're going to make a lot more trips to that compost pile than you probably imagine. So once you've decided on where to place your compost, you need to decide what kind of system you'll use for that. And this is the open system. It's really as simple as it looks. It's just a heap or a pile on the ground. But I've used this type of composting for years. I think it works great, and nothing could be easier, and it certainly couldn't be any cheaper. What I like about this is, first of all, because the microbes in the soil have quick access to everything that you add, that helps with the composting process. It happens a lot faster. I also like the fact that it's out in the open, so it gets the rain and it gets all the air, and I like the access to this. I like being able to just come out and add the ingredients on top, or when it's time to actually harvest the compost, you can get it from any side. But there are some downsides. Because it's out in the open, it gets all the rain, so if you get too much, the pile can get too wet, and that's a bad thing. Or if it doesn't rain enough, then you need to add water because it has to stay moist. The other thing is your neighbors might not be all that crazy about all these ingredients sitting on top. They might be a little nervous about that. Plus, this is pretty inviting to pests and animals. So if that's a concern for you, you probably want to go with a closed system, but there's some other things to consider about an open system that you might like too. If you like the idea of an open system, but you want a little more form or structure, well, you can make your own bin, and certainly there are lots of purchase options for that. The primary advantage, you have sort of a contained area to hold all the compost. Now, it's really important that you can still access the compost, especially when it's full, because you need to turn it and aerate it. In this case, you can remove the front panel. That's really important. But whatever you buy, you need a way to get to that compost. In a closed system like this, nothing can get inside, and your neighbors can't see the food or other compostable ingredients inside, so we resolve those issues. Plus, there are a lot of fancy designs, so if you like the look of one over another, that's another advantage. Also, this does a good job of holding in heat and moisture, so that's all good for helping everything break down. In fact, closed systems make that compost break down more evenly. On the flip side, they can hold in a lot of moisture, almost so much that you need to continue to aerate this to make sure that you don't get it too wet. Now, if you like a lot of compost, you're going to be limited here because you can only put so much in here based on the physical size. Also, when you put in the compost ingredients, it can be a little bit awkward because of the configuration of the system. And in a system like this, when it gets really full, it can get heavy and cumbersome to turn. I even have a difficult time aerating it at that point. Also, when you harvest this, that can be pretty tough too because sometimes those openings aren't all that big. Now, here's another example of a closed system. This one's been in service for years and it's still in great shape. but I wanted you to have another idea of how these can be accessed, not only to add the ingredients, but to take out the finished compost. Plus, how to turn it, because in a closed system, that's always so important. This one happens to have a large gear on the side, which is surprisingly easy to turn, even when it's full. If you like the idea of an open compost system, but you also like the form and structure, and you don't want to spend a lot of money to get it, well, have I got the plan for you. We're going to build it right here, right now. Pallets are everywhere, and they make a great structure for an open bin composting system. You can usually find them for free around loading docks or dumpsters of many businesses. Just make sure to check with the management first for proper permission. We got these pallets from a local company that actually makes them, so they're in pristine condition, but they certainly don't need to be. John and I are making a 3-bin system using 7 pallets of equal size. These happen to be 4 feet by 4 feet, but in looking around for pallets, I discovered they come in a range of sizes. A 3-bin composter is nice if you have the room, since it provides a space for stockpiling raw ingredients, one for active composting, and one for the finished product. Putting this system together couldn't be easier. It's just a matter of connecting one pallet to the next, and there are a number of ways you can do that. In this case, we used 3-inch decking screws to attach the pallets. One at the top, middle, and bottom is all it takes. The beauty of this system is in its simplicity. Other methods for holding each pallet in place include driving 6-foot rebar stakes down through the space of each pallet at the back and front, or simply tying wire or rope around the points where the pallets connect. It's really a matter of personal preference. The sky's the limit on how refined you want to make it. Options can include lightweight covers to prevent too much rain from saturating the working and finished compost, and some people even add hinges to the outer pallet walls to make accessing the compost even easier. And if the gaps in the dividing walls are too broad and you want to prevent the loss of any compost from falling out, you can just get an extra pallet and use the slats from it to simply fill the voids. Well, in less than 10 minutes of real time, a partial box of screws, and help from my friend John, we've got a great 3-bin compost system for absolutely no money. Now, the only thing left to do is fill it up. Thanks, John. Now, if you'd like more information on building this system yourself for no money, we've got all that on our website, and you'll find it under the show notes for this episode. And the address is the same as our name, growingagreenerworld.com. Now that we know that we can compost anywhere and for any budget, what are some of the ingredients that go into making it? Well, you might be surprised to know that a lot of them come from the house, especially the kitchen. Now, a good rule of thumb is anything that came from the ground in its last life, a great candidate for compost, such as fruits and vegetables. But there's some other things in the kitchen that go just as well, like coffee grounds and coffee filters and paper towels and paper towel rolls and napkins. And all those pizza boxes, a lot of those at my house, and newspapers. All of those make great ingredients for compost. But what are some of the things that don't go there? Well, never put meat or grease or dairy. Why? Because those are very attractive to those pests and those other animals that we talked about not wanting to be there. Leave these out and you won't attract the pest. Here's a trick question. What about eggs? Well, the shells are a great ingredient. They have lots of calcium and they break down beautifully. But don't put the ingredients of the shell in there because those also will attract some pests. People want to compost from the kitchen, but they're worried about the smell. Well, you know what? A simple solution, get a stainless steel canister. It's a great way to store those ingredients from day to day. Fill it up and then take it out to the compost pile. But the beauty of this is it doesn't absorb those odors. This works great, and just store it under the counter. Now, what about beyond the kitchen, like your office? Well, we get a lot of paper there, right? Well, the paper itself can go straight into the compost, but a better way is to shred it first because it will break down more quickly. It's a great component. But something you don't want to put into your compost, at least for me, those window envelopes, although the paper works for breaking down, those windows themselves, not very well. So I leave these out and send those to the recycling center. Now, the more you look around your house and your office, the more you're going to see that can go into your compost. And all of that's from just inside the house and the office. Now, from the outside, you're probably never going to have a shortage of ingredients for your compost. And the same rule of thumb applies. If it comes from the ground, it's a good candidate for right there. So let's start with the grass clippings. If you don't grass cycle, that means putting the grass clippings back into the lawn, then you're gonna collect them and put them into your compost because this is a great ingredient. Now in the fall especially, you're gonna have lots of leaves and you certainly wanna add those as well, and also the twigs that are gonna fall down. But be mindful of how thick they are because the thicker, the longer it's gonna take for them to break down. So keep these thin. And as you do your garden cleanup, you wanna put these in the compost as well, with some caveats. Now, if there are any diseases on your plants, when you think about adding them, leave them out and get them off your property because those diseases can actually persist if your compost doesn't get hot enough. You end up adding those diseases back next season. And the same thing applies for weeds. Now, these are about to go to seed, and I don't want to add these to my compost because if it doesn't get hot, again, for the same reasons, these seeds can persist all through the season. I can add these back to my garden next year, and I don't want to do that, and I'm sure you don't either. And there's one final caveat. If you're bringing in ingredients from an outside source, you need to know what their habits are because if they're using pesticides or herbicides, some of those are very persistent and they can actually last through the entire process. You can end up having the opposite effect with your compost and it can do more harm than good. So if you don't know the source, I would just leave it alone and keep it out of the compost. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it will get you started. So once we become a fan of compost, it seems like we can never make it fast enough. But you know what? There are some tricks to speeding up the process. Now, the first thing we often hear about is this ratio of greens to browns, and that's where a lot of people kind of get hung up and intimidated, but it's so simple. Now, when we talk about greens, we're talking about from the outside, plant clippings and grass clippings, basically anything that's green. And from inside, we're talking about those fruits and vegetables. And you want 1 part green to 2 parts brown. Well, what are the browns? From outside, that's gonna be your sticks and twigs and all the leaves. And from inside, basically your paper products. Like remember that paper we shredded and the cardboard? That's your browns. So 2 parts brown, 1 part green, but don't worry about it. If you can't keep up with that, it's gonna happen anyway. Remember, it's just gonna happen faster when 2 parts brown, 1 parts green are added to your compost. Now the next thing to speed up the process, make everything as small as possible that's going into your compost. Like your plants, I'll either cut them or clip them or even tear them, but the smaller the better. And I do that also with my sticks and twigs. Remember I said go with the thin ones? That's because they break down a lot faster. With the paper, I shred the paper. Remember, that's because it breaks down faster. In 2 weeks, you won't even recognize this. Now, the third thing you want to do to always speed up the process is to make sure that you have moisture in your compost, about like a damp sponge. I do it about once a week. The fourth thing is to make sure that you always turn it to introduce more oxygen. That helps everything break down faster. And the beauty of all that is you can do it at the same time. So add some water, turn your pile, add some more water, turn the pile some more, and you're good to go. But the more that you do that, the faster you'll have your compost and the sooner you'll be using it in your garden. One of the best parts about composting is using the finished product and seeing the results that you get in your garden. But there's something else that's just as important, and that's the fact that about 25% of what's in a landfill doesn't need to be there because it can be composted too. So even if you're not a gardener, you can still do your part to grow a greener world. And we have all the information on backyard composting on our website, and you'll find it under the show notes for this episode. The address is the same as our name. It's growingagreenerworld.com. I'm Joe Lample. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here next time for more Growing a Greener World.